So this week we are talking about aggression. What causes people to become aggressive or violent? Why do people maybe become angry but don't become violent? What are the things that lead to aggression? And when we look at what the definition of aggression is, most psychologists will say that aggression is a behavior intended to injure another person. So some key things is, first of all, it's a behavior, which is not the same as anger, although anger can certainly cause us to become aggressive. Anger by itself, and I teach anger management classes, anger by itself is not a bad thing. It's not something that should be suppressed necessarily, but it's something that has to be controlled so that it doesn't cause us to engage in aggression, to engage in a behavior that will injure ourselves or another person. Also, aggression is intended, it's purposeful, it's not accidental, and it is a behavior that is aimed at hurting another person, which is different than assertiveness, which is a behavior intended to express dominance or that the person is confident. Okay, so assertiveness, there's rarely a situation where assertiveness isn't good. I guess I could think of a few things, like if you were a prisoner, maybe being assertive might not be the best thing, but generally speaking, assertiveness is a good thing, while aggressiveness is rarely a good thing. And again, I think that's important to recognize that aggression isn't necessarily always bad. You know, if you are using aggression to protect another person, then, or to protect yourself, then certainly aggression is a good thing. And in our society, we kind of look at aggression as always a negative, and that's not the case. Sometimes, many times, it's negative, but also many times it can be a positive thing that we admire in a person. You know, when a mother protects her children from a kidnapper or a violent husband, then we would admire her aggression in that situation. All right, so anyhow, there are different types of aggression that social psychologists like to distinguish between: indirect and direct aggression. Indirect aggression is an attempt to hurt another person without a face-to-face conflict. So you are doing something behind their back, gossip, posting something nasty on Facebook, versus direct aggression where you're intending to hurt someone and it's direct, it's to their face. It could be a physical hurt like punching the person, it could be verbal like insulting, cussing them out, threatening them, but it is direct. So they're both aggression, they're both behaviors intended to injure another person, but one is a face-to-face confrontation and one is not. So unsurprisingly, we do find that there are gender differences in aggression, although that does depend on how we define aggression. So for example, if we focus on like physical aggression, physical assault, murder, men are substantially more aggressive in that sense, in the physical sense, whereas women are much more likely to use indirect aggression, like hurting others through gossip, spreading rumors. Social rejection is a type of indirect aggression, and in those types of aggression, women are actually more aggressive than men. So I'm not sure if there's really a difference in aggressiveness between men and women, although we often say men are more aggressive, but it just depends on what behaviors you are defining as aggression. Men and women are probably equally aggressive, just they differ in direct versus indirect aggression. We do see that there are different types of aggression, so emotional aggression versus instrumental aggression. I feel like I'm missing a slide here. Let me check my notes. Yeah, maybe not. Okay, so basically when we're looking at emotional versus instrumental, it's another type of distinction of aggression. So we have different categories. We have these indirect versus direct, which we see that there are distinct gender differences. And then there's emotional versus instrumental. And so basically this is more about the motivation for why we participate in aggression rather than the type of aggression being used. So emotional aggression is it's harmful behavior that is caused by emotions, caused by feeling angry. And again, it's not the anger that's necessarily the bad thing, but the aggressive behavior that comes out of it. So that's emotional aggression. And then we have instrumental aggression, which is hurting another person in order to achieve a goal. And we do see, like with domestic violence perpetrators, that there is a distinction in the type of aggression and the type of person who participates in domestic violence. And I'm not sure if this category works with female perpetrators of violence, but I know there is a lot of research behind male offenders. The ones who use emotional aggression, John Gottman, who's a relationship psychologist, he termed those types of men as pit bulls. They get angry quickly, they snap, and then it kind of expends their energy and it's over, like a dog attack. Once a dog bites you, it doesn't go around nursing its, need for vengeance or whatever for the rest of its life. It's done. It's over. You're out of its life, and its anger goes away. And then, so pit bull men, offenders, use emotional aggression. And then he had a second category called cobras, which use instrumental aggression. And these men, when they get angry, they usually get angry slowly, unless it's useful for them to get angry quickly, and then they'll do that. But it's all about what the purpose is in getting angry. It's not just that in the purpose in getting aggressive. They don't get angry. As a matter of fact, his research showed that the pit bulls, when they get angry and they start to show aggressive behavior, their blood pressure skyrockets, their pulse skyrockets, their cortisol levels skyrocket. So these guys are really stressed out. And then they engage in aggressive behavior. But the cobras actually aren't getting angry. When they look angry, their blood pressure is dropping, their heart rate's dropping, their cortisol levels are dropping, everything is calming down. And so when they act aggressively, they are acting out of cold malice when they hurt somebody. And so people will often ask me as a domestic violence counselor, how can you handle working with these men? And the truth is, and I always hear this, they're monsters. How can you work with monsters? And the pit bulls aren't monsters. The cobras are monsters. And the cobras, when they get caught, they're usually in prison for life because they've murdered their wife or girlfriend. The pit bulls are just regular guys who are poorly socialized and they can't control their feelings and they don't know what to do about it, and so they lash out. And those guys, they're generally speaking nice, decent guys that just don't have the skills to handle a relationship. And so it's very rewarding working with them because they want to have a good relationship. They don't like being that angry. They don't like being aggressive. They want the relationship to work. And many of the men I work with, they stay with the woman that they hurt and that caused them to be in domestic violence counseling. And years later, sometimes I see them, because Lucerne Valley is a small town, and they'll very happily introduce me to their wife and kids. Well, this is the one that I punched. Do you remember that? And I'm not making it up. That's what they'll say in the middle of a grocery store. And so it's actually great working with them because they aren't monsters. They're using emotional aggression. They're angry. They're hurt. And so they lash out and hurt somebody else. But the cobras will hurt in order to have power over you, in order to control you. And luckily, these guys, these sociopaths, are very, very much less common than the pit bulls. So this is a chart showing homicides committed by each sex. So you can see that overwhelmingly men are the ones that commit homicide. Women obviously do too, but men are committing somewhere close to 90% and women hover around 10%. Interestingly, they committed more homicides back in the 60s, 70s, 80s than they do nowadays. Not sure why. Maybe this is because this was the feminist era, right? This is when women were being empowered and so on, so maybe they felt empowered to do in the men. I'm not sure. But also, men are much more likely to kill their significant other. So 50% of female homicides are by their husband or their boyfriend. More often by their boyfriend than their husband, so you're safer being married than just dating. But men are definitely more likely to act out in that direct physical aggression than women are. And part of it's also because there are consequences for women if they try to act aggressive. And when you look at female domestic violence, because I do also work with female felons who have gone to prison for violence, they rarely shoved him or did something light. Usually it's they took a baseball bat to him. I had one who she broke his jaw. She broke, I think it was 6 ribs. She bit him like 5 times. Like nasty, nasty bites. I saw pictures. I mean, she didn't do it lightly. And at the clinic I work at, we always say that when women offend, they're either doing it in retaliation, meaning they're getting back at him, or they're doing it as prevention because they know it's coming, and so they're going to get him before he gets her. And so usually women are doing it out of a feeling of victimization. Also are men, but usually it's, as they always put it, she pushed my buttons. And so they feel victimized. But women are doing it usually out of fear of what is physically coming or what has already physically happened. And so it's a very different motivation. And then when women do it, they do it seriously. They don't mess around. If they're going to actually be physically direct, have physical direct aggression, they're doing it hardcore. They're not messing around. Because you've got to make sure that he can't come back and get you. Because if he does, then, I mean, have you ever played like punch each other as hard as you can? And you guys won't get this, but us girls, like, you know, okay, so personal example, I had a boyfriend who, I don't remember why, but he said, hit me as hard as you can. And so I did. I punched him as hard as I could, and he laughed. And then he said, okay, it's my turn. No, I don't think so. That's I'm going to be in the hospital, you know, even if it's my arm. You poke me in my arm and it hurts for like 5 minutes. So yeah, if you're going to attack a man, you're going to make sure that it's done seriously, because otherwise he's going to turn around and get you back 50 times harder than you ever tried. And so that's what we see with female domestic violence. All right, so why are we aggressive? Why is there domestic violence? Why is there murder? So there are multiple reasons, and there's multiple theories. One is an instinct. So Freud believed that there were life instincts and death instincts, that we had an instinctual drive to survive, but also in some sense an instinctual drive to hurt ourselves and to die, which didn't last very long, because this was also the time of Darwin's theory of evolution, and that certainly flies in the face of Darwin's theory that we are driven to survive. But I do think, I disagree that humans have a complete drive to survive, because often, like we talked about in the pro-social chapter, oftentimes we sacrifice ourselves for others, and there are things above our need for survival. Humans are complex, and we're not controlled by one drive. We're not controlled by instincts. Although we may have them, we have enough complex thoughts to overcome. So we might want to survive, but there's many situations where we would fight against that instinctual drive of survival. So another theory is displacement. There was a psychologist named Konrad Lorenz that you probably learned about in Psych 101. He's the one that did the goose experiment with imprinting, where he trained, he didn't train them, the geese just instinctually imprinted on him and followed him everywhere. But he also said that humans have this innate urge to attack. We have this aggression, and these aggressive urges will build up over time until they're discharged. And when that energy is expressed, it's called displacement. If it's expressed indirectly, then it's displacement. So I take the anger, and Freud also, you've probably heard this concept more with Freud than Konrad Lorenz. And I would say that this was Freud's theory originally, even though your book seems to give more credit to Lorenz, but Freud lived before Lorenz, so yeah, this is more Freud's theory. But, so both of these guys said that we have anger and we'll take it out on something else. So you're angry at your boss, but you can't take it out on that person, so you have to displace it. You have to direct it to something else because it's not safe. And so maybe this is why a woman will come home and yell at her children after a rough day at work. The kids didn't do anything wrong, but she has this aggression, this buildup of anger, and so the urge to act aggressively comes out in a different way, taking it out on another person. Or punching the wall would also be displacement. And then catharsis is the discharge of an aggressive impulse. So this is when you directly express the pent-up emotion. So you punch your boss. Freud also believed that you could have a cathartic release by watching someone else be aggressive. Like you could go to a boxing match and watch somebody beat somebody else up, and that would get rid of your aggression. But research shows that that's not true, that watching violence actually increases violence, which we're going to talk about later in this chapter. All right, evolutionary theorists, do I have the slide about this? Not really. So evolutionary theorists say that humans aren't programmed to be blindly aggressive, like Lauren's kind of said. Aggressive behavior is one strategy for survival and for reproduction. So it's useful in some situations, but not in most others. And if we look at different animal species, aggression has been found to serve quite a few goals. So it allows animals to control their territorial boundaries, to divide up their resources, to defend their young. But because aggression always bears the risk of retaliation and could result in injury or death, pure hostility with no immediate useful goal would hurt an animal's chance to survive and reproduce. And so that's why they might explain why we are aggressive in certain situations and not in other ones. And the research does support that in a lot of ways, that, for instance, animals are more aggressive during breeding season. Humans are more aggressive when poverty is more rampant, so that's the limited resources. So these things do increase aggression in both animals and humans. So according to your textbook's authors, there's 4 functions served by aggression: to cope with feelings of annoyance, to gain material and social rewards, to gain or maintain social status, and to protect oneself or the members of one's group. Protection. So it's interesting because somebody asked me just the other day, why is it that women are attracted to bad boys instead of like the nice guy? And I think the reason is because the bad boy, quote unquote bad boy, is aggressive, shows aggressive behavior, and aggression means that it is a male who's more likely to, I don't really know about this one so much, but more likely to achieve these last 3 goals: to gain material and social rewards, to gain or maintain social status, and to protect oneself or the members of one's group. So a man who is aggressive, a bad boy, is more likely to protect you, to protect your children, to give you financial protection. And there's tons of research showing that what women are truly attracted to is a man who can keep her and her children alive. That's what women really want in the most fundamental sense. And so the characteristics of the villain or the anti-hero or the bad boy is something that on a subconscious level indicates that this is a man who's able to provide and protect. So there you go. That's why. And that's why women often get themselves into trouble, because that's not always the case. All right. So why do we get aggressive? So one is coping with feelings of annoyance. So the frustration aggression hypothesis, it was come up within 1939, and then it's sort of been reformulated. I don't know why textbooks have to go through the history of theories instead of just whatever the latest one is, but it's in your textbook. So the first one assumes that aggression is an automatic response whenever a goal-directed behavior is blocked. So you want to do something, you can't do that thing, so therefore you become frustrated, and because you're frustrated, you become aggressive. And certainly that is the case in many situations, although not all. So then in the 80s, a guy named Berkowitz came up with this reformulation of the frustration aggression hypothesis. And what he said is that frustration is linked only to emotional aggression, which is I'm angry and so therefore I act aggressively. That's the emotional aggression versus the instrumental aggression. So, if you are truly angry, then you become frustrated. frustration leads to aggression, but only when that frustration generates negative feelings. So you can actually be frustrated and there's positive feelings like, oh, I bought you a birthday present, but I'm not telling you what it is. That is a type of frustration, but certainly it's a positive frustration, or it's a frustration that results in positive feelings. So it has to be a type of frustration that is born of anger, that leads to more negative feelings, and then the unpleasant feelings lead to the aggressive behavior. Because obviously, if you're feeling positive feelings, why would you become aggressive? All right. So it's kind of common sense, but it's nice to have a theory to think about things in a more cohesive manner, as well as to do experiments. Okay. So that's why psychology has so many obvious explanations, because it actually is helpful. But then he also believed that there's additional factors in determining whether the unpleasant feelings actually lead to overt aggressive behavior, whether you act on those unpleasant feelings. So he said it's much more complex than this automatic response. Humans don't really, we do have automatic responses, but they're modulated by many different things: our memories, our coping skills, so on. So this is the simple one, the original theory. You're frustrated, and frustration leads to aggression. End of story. Berkowitz, with the reformulated frustration-aggression hypothesis, said you're frustrated, and then maybe there's also these other situations. Maybe you're in pain, maybe it's really hot, or other unpleasant things. These lead to negative feelings, and the negative feelings lead to emotional aggression. And I think we can all agree that this is certainly the case. But this isn't wrong. It's just too simple. All right. Do I talk about all these? Yeah, okay. So, all right. So these are the other things that determine whether we act on that frustration and that negative feelings. Okay. So we're going to be talking about these other aspects that kind of mesh into the frustration and cause us to act out. Stupid thing. Okay. So the excitation transfer theory, this is another one, says that anger is physiologically similar to other emotional states, and any form of emotional arousal can enhance aggressive response. So, one thing I see in domestic violence counseling is that men and women often have a hard time recognizing what emotions they're feeling. And many times they just assume it's anger. I'm sad? No, it's anger. I am excited? No, it's anger. Everything is kind of anger, because really, if you describe what does it feel like physically to be happy, your muscles are tense, your heart rate's up, your blood pressure is up, your skin feels warm. That's the same thing you would say if you were angry. So the physiological state of your body is almost identical with anger to other emotions. Fear, you actually get cold and clammy, so that's a little easier to distinguish, but many other emotions feel physically the same way that anger does. And so therefore, your body can misinterpret any type of physiological arousal as anger leading to an aggressive response. This is why, you might see in a movie that somebody's kid got into a dangerous situation and the parents are so afraid and so just their bodies are just so physiologically aroused that when the kid gets to them, instead of just crying and expressing their fear and sadness and whatever, they yell at the kid. Okay, that's what the excitation transfer theory is our body can often misinterpret what we're feeling. So irritability is one of the things that we find triggers aggressive behavior. Now, irritability is not the same as anger, but it is the same physiological state as anger. So there is a connection between type A personalities and aggressive behavior. Type A personality, which I'm sure you know, is a group of characteristics that the person's competitive, the person feels always urgent, they're always in a rush, they always need to get things done, and they're always taking on more. And it is associated with a higher risk for coronary heart disease, versus the type B, who's laid back and not super competitive. Okay, type A's tend to work harder, rise higher in their professions, they have more conflicts on the job. Now, what we found is that it's not really the type A personality, which is what researchers have said for years, but it's that type A personalities tend to be more irritable and hostile, And it's the irritability and hostility that leads to coronary heart disease and depression and other negative outcomes, aggressive behavior, and so on. So you can be a type A personality without being hostile. But type A personalities are more likely to be chronically irritable and hostile. All right. So, and that irritability, being a type A personality, is associated with aggressive behavior. Now, pain in the body feels a lot like anger. And there's a link between pain and increased aggression. All right. So, in one series of experiments, students were assigned the role of supervisors, and they administered shocks and rewards to other students who were working under them. And when the supervisor was feeling pain, they became more aggressive. They recommended more shocks and fewer rewards to the students that they were supervising. Okay, so that was a good experiment to show that if you are in pain, you participate. You are more likely to be aggressive, less likely to be rewarding to others around you. Okay, and you only have to watch a show like House to see that in action. His leg hurts him all the time, and so he's a nasty, hostile person. Okay, and try being in pain, and your child comes and asks you silly little questions, and try to react appropriately. It's hard to do that. Also, heat. There is a lot of evidence to show that the hotter the weather, the more aggressive people are. So crime in general, and certainly physical assaults, murders, and so on, increase as the temperature goes up. Now, that's only true to a certain temperature. So somewhere around 100 degrees, the crime starts to decrease, and the theory is that it's too hot to commit a crime at that point. So heat increases violent behavior, and then at a certain point it just drops off because you just can't move, let alone go murder somebody. All right, so this is an interesting one, experiment that was done with baseball pitchers. So this is how many players were hit with the baseball. So the batters, how many batters were hit as the temperature goes up. And you can see that pitchers hit almost twice as many batters in the 90s than when the temperature is below 70 degrees. Okay, so they believe it's not due to heat-induced error or other things, that it's done on purpose because they're angry. Like, that spike is way too high for it to just be done accidentally. The pitcher's annoyed and hits the batter on purpose. All right, and then obviously other unpleasant situations like poverty. We talked about that before. There was one experiment that was done in the 40s to analyze the price of cotton and the number of lynchings that happened in the South during, what were the years, 1882 to 1930. And they found that the worse the economy was doing, the lower the price of cotton, the higher the number of lynchings. So people in poverty were taking aggression out on others. And that's just one example of aggressive behavior. This happens in every culture throughout history. If you are in poverty, you are more likely to become aggressive. This is also true with the concept of relative deprivation, just feeling that you have less than others. So consider in our country, people complain about poverty in various cultures, not just one, many cultures. And those cultures, we often attribute higher levels of violence to those cultures because of poverty. However, if you consider poverty in the United States, even the worst kind of poverty is better than what normal life is in many third world countries. So we feel relatively deprived. We're not as well off as other people. I only have a small apartment, and I only have a little TV, and I don't have the newest iPhone, and so therefore my life is terrible. But other people are starving to death. You don't get a lot of starving to death in the United States because we are a wealthy country. But that doesn't matter because our mind only works relatively. We feel deprived relative to the people around us, not relative to the people dying of malaria in Malawi. We feel bad compared to the super rich people that we see on TV. Okay, and so poverty is a relative term. Okay, so cognitive neo-association. According to this theory, when people get annoyed, they change how they think. So an unpleasant situation triggers this chain of internal events, internal to our psyche. So the first step in the process is that the unpleasant event unleashes negative feelings. Okay, so unpleasant experience, whatever it is, causes negative feelings. And then when one negative feeling or thought occurs, it activates this host of related negative memories. So do I have, I guess angry thoughts and associations is kind of like, it reminds you of other negative things in life. Causes negative feelings. Yeah, so it feeds back to cause more negative feelings. Causes negative behaviors. Okay, you have fearful thoughts and associations. And then there's various other cues in your environment that may trigger more aggression. For instance, if there is a gun in the house, people are more likely to act out in a physically aggressive manner. There was even some experiment done where just regular people randomly sent to different rooms. One room had a gun in it, and I assume a fake gun, or at least an unloaded gun, and they had to do some task, I can't remember what it was, but some task that caused frustration, and the rooms where there was a gun in the room was more likely to trigger aggressive behavior. However, they've also found that certain things modify that. So like if you grow up in a household with guns, if you're educated on gun safety and so on, then you don't see that sort of effect from it. So certainly a gun just by itself doesn't cause people to act out aggressively, but it is a factor in causing aggressive behavior. All right, and we call that the weapons effect. And it's not just guns, by the way, it's also knives and so on. I think we talked about this already. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's all the things we just talked about. All right, so another thing that happens is that we create our own annoying situations. So sometimes it's your own fault that you're annoyed. So type A people, for instance, tend to go out of their way to choose situations that are competitive, that have time urgency, that are frustrating. They like those sort of stressful situations, and so it's more likely to trigger their annoyance. So we often choose to annoy ourselves. Okay, and people who act aggressively are more likely to create a life and to create experiences that elicit aggression. Okay, so if you're a nice, calm person, you're probably not going to, go walk into some gang territory and mad dog some punk on the street and get into a fight, right? But if you're an aggressive person, you're much more likely to do that. Do people still say mad dog? Probably not. Okay, I think we've talked about this. All right, social learning theory. This is Albert Bandura, if you remember the Bobo doll study. I'll try to remember to put a link to that study, a video of the study, just in case you had a bad teacher and you didn't learn about that. So basically, Albert Bandura said that aggressive behavior is caused by seeing aggression and by being rewarded for aggression. And in his Bobo doll study, he found... let me just explain it in case you haven't learned about it. So Bobo doll was this clown that was weighted at the bottom. It's like this blow-up clown, and kids could hit it, and it would bounce back up so that you could hit it again. And so he had kids go into a room full of toys, and if there was a Bobo doll, and he just looked to see how violent were they towards the Bobo doll, or how violent was their behavior in general, how aggressive was their behavior. And then he had the child watch an adult or another child, or in one experiment he had somebody dress up as a cartoon cat, or he also had them watch a cartoon of the Bobo doll being beat up. And he found, which doesn't surprise us nowadays, that the kids who saw somebody else beating up the Bobo doll were more likely to beat it up. They were also more likely to come up with unique ways, like getting a toy gun and shooting it, which they didn't see anybody do. But they had more of these aggressive behaviors. Now this was, it seems obvious to us today, but it was not obvious back then, because this was when we had the theory of catharsis, that if you watched aggression, it decreased aggression. And so Albert Bandura, with his social learning theory, showed that aggression is increased by seeing aggression. And then he did another experiment where the person who was beating up the Bobo doll was either rewarded or they were yelled at for beating up the doll. And again, unsurprisingly to us today, the kid who watched the person being rewarded for their aggressiveness was more likely to be aggressive. Okay, so if you are rewarded for your aggressive behavior, then you will be more aggressive. Now, obviously, a psychopath or a sociopath there are some types of rewards that they get in being violent. There's personal gain. That's one thing. Also, a person like a serial murderer who kills another person or hurts them in some way, oftentimes they might be doing it out of a sort of revengeful way, like maybe they have issues with their mother, and so they take it out on other women. Maybe they were rejected sexually, so they rape women as a way to get back at them. Maybe they feel dirty and unclean and evil, and so they go after prostitutes because they are participating in evil, unclean behavior. So there's a lot of motivations to their violence, and they get some type of reward from it. Also, we do admire aggressive people in our society. Meek and mild people are not very rewarded in Western cultures. And so there is some type of reward in that assertiveness and aggressiveness. So there's many different ways that a psychopath or a sociopath might receive rewards for violence. And also some cultures, I put a video on Canvas for this, some cultures reward aggression in general. So like where I live in Lucerne Valley, I've heard many people who grew up here say that they were often told by their parents to beat a certain kid up. So they might come home and complain about this bully, and they were told, go beat that kid up or I'll beat you. And so they were punished for being peaceful, and they were rewarded for violence. And yeah, you'll learn more about that in the video that I posted, but culture certainly plays a big role in it. All right, some other factors. Empathy. So do you share the emotions of others? And certainly sociopaths do not. That's the definition of a sociopath. Psychopaths might feel empathy, but their brain's broken, so they're just not firing on all four cylinders. But a sociopath doesn't feel for the other person, or doesn't feel strongly at least. And so if you have feelings of empathy, then it makes aggressive behavior painful and unrewarding. So you really want to encourage empathy in your children and other people. And due to lack of empathy, this should really be sociopaths, feel less compunction about hurting others. It doesn't bother them, and so they only get reward and no punishment. Alcohol intoxication suppresses feelings of pain, physically as well as emotionally, which also suppresses feelings of empathy. So when you are under the influence of alcohol, you feel less empathic, and so you can hurt others or participate in aggressive behavior more easily because you're not feeling empathic pain from hurting another person. And so that's why often normal people who wouldn't normally be aggressive or wouldn't normally do horrific things will do horrific things under the influence of alcohol. 80% of violent crimes are done under the influence of alcohol. Okay, another factor. Violence is glamorized in the media. So the more, we've had this question for decades, since Albert Bandura and probably before. If you watch violence, does it increase violence? And overwhelmingly, the research says yes. There are some studies that say no. Some studies that they're not sure. But the majority of studies say yes. The more violence you watch, the more violent you are. Now the question is a violent person attracted to aggressive television? Or is it the aggressive, violent television or movies or magazines or social media or whatever that causes the person to become aggressive? So there have been some experimental studies that have been done where they have randomly exposed people to violent media. And they do find that exposure to violent media leads to more aggressive behavior. Now, it's hard to have a firm conclusion because you're not controlling what this person has seen their entire lives. And certainly there's many people who watch very violent stuff and they don't become serial murderers. But there are certain things that all serial killers do have in common. They watch violent horror films, slashers, murder and mayhem, and violent pornography. Those are two things that every serial killer on the planet will have exposure to, have interest in. But again, is that because that's what they watched, and so it caused that, or is that what they were attracted to, and so therefore that's what they watched? Hard to say. It's really hard to say. But I would say that if I was a parent, I would not be letting my children watch that. I used to watch The Walking Dead, and then we got up to the baseball bat scene, and I was like, I'm done. Because I don't want that type of influence on my mind, on my soul. I think you do have to protect yourself to some degree. How much influence will that have on you? I don't know. But do you want to take the risks? How much of that exposure are you going to allow yourself to have? And more, just regular television, even kids' television, is becoming more and more violent. What would be a PG movie now, back in the 50s, would have probably been an R. We definitely expose ourselves to a lot more intense stuff than we did before. Alright, you can read more about this stuff. I have a video where Ted Bundy talks about violent pornography. If you don't know who Ted Bundy is, he was a big time serial killer I know he killed some women in Utah, and I think Washington, if I remember right. And there's a really good Netflix series about him, so you should watch that. But the video that I posted was an interview that he gave, and he actually requested this guy named Dr. Dobson, who runs an organization called Focus on the Family. It's a Christian organization about improving relationships. And he asked this guy to come interview him the night before he was executed so that Ted Bundy could tell the world basically how bad pornography was and how much it influenced him. And if you watch shows about murderers, almost every single one, they'll mention that the guy was into pornography. And so there's a lot of negative effects from pornography. And according to the research, not just violent pornography, but pornography, it's addictive. It works just like a drug, releasing dopamine and other chemicals in the brain. And so it has an addictive quality to it. And you can, I'm trying to think of what the term is for drug use, but where you get used to it, tolerance. So you can develop tolerance to pornography just like you can develop tolerance to cocaine. And so then the need for more and more of it builds up and you get into harder pornography. And according to Ted Bundy, eventually if you have a bad enough addiction, then that need for violent pornography turns into a need for real life violent pornography that you perpetrate onto a woman. So anyhow, we'll watch that video because it's really interesting. All right, we kind of talked about this. So testosterone, social status, testosterone leads to more aggression and behavior, although aggression and aggressive behavior also causes higher testosterone levels. We do see higher levels of testosterone in people with antisocial behavior, prison inmates, military veterans, and so on. But, even a very nice low testosterone person, male or female, if they participate in aggressive behavior, their testosterone levels will increase. So again, it's kind of a chicken or the egg thing with testosterone. And we did try chemical castration back in the, 70s, 80s, in order to decrease testosterone in perpetrators, and we found that didn't really help with stopping crime. So testosterone is associated with criminal behavior, with heightened aggressiveness, but it's not necessarily the cause of it. Although administration of testosterone does increase aggressiveness. But again, does that mean that it creates crime? Not necessarily. It's a complex relationship. All right, the video that I put up also talks about the culture of honor. So in the South and in different places like the Middle East, there is a culture of honor, meaning that you are taught that you should stand up for yourself and possibly for other people. And it's, if necessary, you will use violence in order to stand up for yourself. And so there are certain cultural norms, certain places in the world where there is a strong sense of honor, of the need to defend oneself or others. And the people from a culture of honor are more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. I'm not going to go into that too much because, like I said, I do have a video of that. So, all right. Okay, so here's another interesting study that kind of shows you how complex the testosterone connection is. So one study found that testosterone contributes to risk of antisocial behavior only in lower class men. So this is your socioeconomic status. If you are lower class, so this might be like, I don't know, a construction worker or a plumber or some job that is, although plumbers do make a lot of money, but it's your social class as well as your economic class. So it's not just how much money you make, but what do you feel your social ranking is. So the lower you feel your social ranking is, and this is really a personal thing too, especially in our country. So do you rank yourself lower or do you rank yourself higher? And what we found is that the lower you rank yourself, the lower your class, then the more testosterone affects your aggressive behavior. So this is adult delinquency, adult crime. Whereas higher socioeconomic status, you are less likely to commit crimes in general. And then if you have high testosterone levels, it really doesn't affect, this is probably not a significant difference, it doesn't really affect whether you act out or not. It also might be that you feel like you have more to lose. And so even if you feel more aggressive because you have higher testosterone levels, you don't act out on it. Or perhaps you have ways you can act out on it that are socially acceptable. Like you can fire your subordinates, and that makes you feel better. And so you don't need to go punch somebody like this guy does. So it's complex. Yeah, you can read more about that. Oh, this is an interesting one. So defensive attributional style. Do you have a tendency to notice threats and to interpret the behavior of others as intentionally meant to harm? So people in a culture of honor have a defensive attributional style, or they're more likely to have that. So you notice threats more often, and you believe that those threats are harmful, that they're more likely to hurt you. Women are much more likely than men to have a defensive attributional style. So I like asking this in class on campus. If you're walking through, for you guys, if you're walking through the parking lot and it's nighttime and you're alone and you see somebody walking, 100 feet away from you, what is your emotional reaction? And in the past when I've asked this, guys in class have said, I assume he's going to his car too, or I don't know, I don't really have any emotional reaction to him. That's the most common one. Or maybe, I keep an eye on him just in case, but I'm not really, that worried. When I ask women, usually the first thing the girls in class say is, I'm concerned about being raped, or I'm afraid, or, there's immediately a fearful reaction. So we notice threats right away. The guys look at him and say, probably not a threat, or could be a threat, we'll keep an eye on it. And the women say, it is a threat. If there's another person there and I am by myself, it's just a threat, end of story. Everything is a threat. And then the slightest behavior is viewed as potentially harmful. If they start coming towards you, you're probably going to rush to your car. Or maybe you'll rush back onto campus into the classroom where things are safe. And so one of the reasons why women have a more defensive attributional style is because it's much easier for them to be hurt. They can't defend themselves as well as a man can. And so they have to have this attributional style in order to protect themselves. Okay, so women are much more likely to have that. All right. Obviously, you can defend. Defense is a big part of aggressive behavior, whether you need to protect yourself or others. Women are more likely to be on the receiving end of bullying in relationships. Like I said before, half of the women killed in the U.S. are killed by their partners. Men are more likely to kill as like a pattern of harassment and control, whereas women are more likely to kill in self-defense, which is what I found working with women in domestic violence and men. So basically, we look at this effect-danger ratio. So this is our personal assessment of how likely there is to be a benefit of being aggressive versus the dangers of being aggressive. And so men often find a higher effect-to-danger ratio, that there's more benefit and less danger if they are aggressive towards their female partner, their wife or girlfriend. Whereas women see more of a danger in it, and so they're less likely to act aggressively because there's less benefit and there's a lot more danger in it. So that's one thing that we take into account when we are aggressive, is how much danger is there in being aggressive. You know, you see that in movies where a guy's, in a bar or whatever, and he's being a punk, and then the guy he's being a jerk to stands up and he's like 3 times his size, and all of a sudden you back down. So that's the effect-danger ratio. Perceived threat plays a big role. So perceived threat is, so basically, what do you see as a threat? So when one researcher asked some teenagers what triggered their everyday feelings of anger, the most frequently mentioned answer was someone else's intentional act of being unreasonable, insulting them, teasing them, physically harassing them. College students were asked, like, well, I won't get into that, but so basically, do you perceive somebody else as a threat or not? And this is kind of, it probably should be under the defensive attributional style. But one thing you see is that, like the book says, the dangers go up for African American adolescents. So teenagers in general are more likely to be threatened. Teenagers are less likely to be able to defend themselves, children as well. But children are less likely to be threatened than teenagers. And then you see a lot of this with the African American adolescents. So, and obviously right now this is a huge issue in our society, where black teenagers are seen as a threat by police and being shot and whatever. And I'm not going to get into whether it's justified or not. Please, let's just leave that for another class. But the truth is that it's happening. And so why is this happening? Well, one thing is that the police are seeing these African Americans, usually males, as more of a threat. And then also the black teenagers are seeing the cops more as a threat. So I had a student a few years back who, his brother, they were in the park, it was evening, and I think they'd gotten out of a late class and were walking home or something like that. And his little brother was ahead of him, and some cops were looking through the neighborhood for somebody who had committed a crime. Breaking and entering, I don't remember, something like that. And they didn't suspect it was this kid, but they just stopped to talk to him to see if he had seen anything. And when my student saw 2 police officers talking to his, black teenage brother, he flipped out and he went running towards them, just shouting and saying, "Don't shoot him, don't shoot him." And this student, he's got to have weighed, 400 pounds and was 6'5". He was huge guy. And he was so offended that the cops pulled a gun on him. And I was like, what did you think the cops would, perceived threat. If a 400-pound guy was running towards me in the dark screaming at me, I would wish I had a gun. It's no wonder that there's so many police violence issues nowadays, because everybody's seeing each other as a threat. So the teenagers are seeing the cops as a threat, the cops are seeing the teenagers as a threat, and so you have this huge rate of perceived threat, which obviously leads to hugely aggressive behavior. Yeah, so anyhow, self-protective aggression increases danger. I think we all know that. All right, and then adding a gun to the mix. Not that I'm anti-gun, but certainly I think we can all recognize that guns cause higher levels of, well, not higher levels of violence, but more intense violence, right? Shooting somebody or punching somebody is a very different thing. But again, an argument for another class. All right, so how do we reduce violence? Rewarding alternatives to aggression. So your kid comes home and says, they refuse to fight with a kid and instead they talked it out, and you go buy them ice cream for that. That was wonderful. Instead of beating your kid for not fighting them, as sometimes happens. So that's at the parental level. Also, on the societal level, we could, I don't know, have rewards for, we do have rewards for peaceful people, I guess. We have peace prizes. And so we do kind of reward that in a lot of ways. Legal punishments, they work, but they're not great. Okay, so punishment can suppress aggressive behavior in the short run, but depending on the punishment, can teach aggression over the long run, like beating your kid. I'm not anti-spanking either, but I do recognize that there are certainly issues to it. The more you spank, the more research shows that it leads to aggression in your child. Usually parents who spank their kids a lot are very inconsistent. They don't do a lot of talking it out or recognition of emotions, and those are all things that cause aggression. So if you save spanking for a special occasion when the kid has done something absolutely horrific and you spank the kid, then it probably teaches them a good lesson. But if it's just sort of your first go-to, instead of talking to the kid about what they've done, or instead of, trying to think of something, if spanking is just the lazy way of parenting, it's certainly going to lead to more aggressive behavior. If you spank, you need to do extra hard work in dealing with your child's emotions. Okay, so I think there's a lot of more effective ways of parenting than spanking, although I don't think if you spank your kid, you're going to ruin your child. But again, everything in psychology is complex. That's why it's an interesting topic. Okay, at the societal level, legal punishment has not been found to be particularly effective deterrents to violence, and that's because there's so many factors affecting why people are violent. Certainly, legal punishment has decreased violence. Certainly it has. It's ridiculous to say that it has not been found to be effective at all. If you look at places where there are not legal deterrents, or historical periods in time where there's not legal punishment for crime, then you see violence at way higher levels. But it's probably not the most effective way to decrease violence. Perhaps more effective ways would be to decrease poverty, to teach values, to teach love. I know I've talked about it before about like Christian duty and things like that with pro-social behavior. But if you create a culture of compassion and love and, positivity or whatever, I sound like a hippie, but you get what I'm saying. If you create a culture of anti-violence, then you will have less violence. And that is way more effective than just punishing people for violent behavior. You need to create a desire for a peaceful world in order to actually decrease violence. All right, anyhow, I sound too much like a hippie Quaker, so, although my family used to be hippie Quakers, so I guess that's why. Okay, so, some other things you can do. Curfew for your kids, not just the troublemakers, but every kid should have a curfew. You should not be letting your kid out all night hanging out with friends. That's bad. That's the perfect way to get your kid into trouble. And obviously other things, pro-social activities, parental involvement, blah, blah, blah. I think we get the idea. Gun control, that is obviously a very controversial topic. Could gun control decrease violence? Well, obviously it would decrease some level of gun violence, but it is, you have illegal weapons. Most people I know out here in Lucerne who have guns don't have them legally, or they're not registered at least. I hope you can't hear my dog barking his head off in the background, but I have to get my gun out and stop that. No, just kidding, don't report me. So In areas of the country where there's strong levels of gun violence, there's usually high levels of crime. Now, did gun control cause high levels of crime, or did high levels of crime make people want gun control? That's something that's debated. Places where guns are everywhere usually have low levels of crime. But again, it's not that simplistic, right? It's much more complex than that. And I don't really want to get fired, so I'm not going to get into it too much. We'll let you guys debate that on your own. But there's a lot of research going either way. So, all right, so that's basically it. Yeah, I think we covered everything. So if you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise, I will see you in the next lecture. Bye.